The human soul is a semi-mythical object that cannot be seen with the naked eye or touched with the hands. Many articles have been written on the topic of the human soul, but all of them include only theoretical knowledge. A more complex project was undertaken by a scientist named Duncan McDougall. A world-famous doctor of science, he decided to do the impossible, to weigh the matter that is commonly called the human soul. The existence of the soul is a powerful concept, a central part of many religions, calming in the face of death. Perhaps this is why some were unhappy with the fact that questions of the soul were not left to faith, and turned their attention to science to prove that the soul exists. If you have ever heard that the soul weighs 21 grams, or have seen the 2003 film, 21 grams, hinting at this fact, then you may have heard about the results of one of these rather unusual experiments. So how much does the soul really weigh? Well, the bad news is that, of course, no one can say. Science can't prove the soul exists, and scientists can't weigh it. But the strange story of one doctor's attempt to weigh the soul is worth telling. The story begins in the early 20th century in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. A respected physician named Duncan McDougall had an idea for a study. If people have souls, he thought, those souls must take up space. And if souls take up space, they must have weight, right? There was only one way to find out, McDougall reasoned. Since the substance in question in our hypothesis is organically associated with the body before death, it seems to me more reasonable to think that it must be some form of gravitational matter, and therefore detectable at death by weighing the person at the moment of death. He wrote in a paper he eventually published in 1907. McDougall teamed up with the Dorchester Hospice for patients with advanced tuberculosis, a disease then considered incurable. McDougall built a large scale large enough to hold a cot and a dying tuberculosis patient. The doctor explained in his paper that tuberculosis was a convenient disease for this experiment because patients died in great exhaustion and without any movement that might tip his scales. McDougall's first patient, a man, died on April 10, 1901, and the doctor noticed a sudden drop in his weight of 21 grams. The patient had been in a most fearful condition for several hours, but immediately after his heart had given its last beat, the pointer of the scale dropped sharply to the even figure of 3/4 of an ounce or 21 grams, the doctor wrote. The New York Times reported on March 11, 1907, at the moment when life ceased, the opposite side of the scale dropped with astonishing suddenness, as if something had been suddenly removed from the body. All the usual deductions for physical loss of weight were immediately made, and it was found that a full ounce of weight was still unaccounted for. It did not matter much that McDougall's next patient lost 14 grams 15 minutes after he stopped breathing, or that his third case showed an unexplained two-step loss of 14 grams, then another 28 grams a minute later. McDougall excluded case number 4, a woman dying of diabetes, because the scale was poorly calibrated, in part due to considerable interference by persons opposed to the work, which raises several questions that McDougall did not seem keen to answer in his report. Patient number 5 lost 10 grams of weight, but the scale subsequently malfunctioned, casting doubt on that number as well. Case 6 was ruled out because the patient died while McDougall was still setting up his scale. McDougall's study had a tiny sample size, and his results were all over the place, but even at the time, it cast serious doubt on the weight loss being related to soul mass. Afterwards, the doctors present at the study conducted their own experiments. It turned out that the patients did not lose the same amount of weight, but there was still a loss that no one could explain. The doctors took into account all sorts of factors, such as air in the lungs, fluids in the body, and more. Incidentally, patient 3 retained his previous weight after he died. But a minute later, he, like the others, still lost about an ounce. Dr. McDougall explained it this way. I believe that in the case of a phlegmatic person, slow in thought and action, the soul remained suspended in the body after death for a minute before its release. There is no other way to explain it. And after comparing all the results of the analyses, Dr. McDougall came to the conclusion that the human soul weighs approximately 21 grams. He also had to conduct the same experiment on 15 dogs. In this case, the scales did not show any change in weight after their death, which led the doctor to the erroneous conclusion, only people have souls. He also tried to get photographs of the soul leaving the human body, but he was unable to achieve any new scientific discoveries in this matter. To his credit, McDougall admitted that additional measurements were needed to confirm that the soul has weight. This did not happen, partly for ethical reasons, and partly because his experiments were a little strange. Can the American doctor's experiments be considered accurate and realistic? It is difficult to answer these questions, but skeptics did not dare to conduct similar studies even after McDougall's death. And according to Mary Roach's book, Ghost, Science Tackles the Afterlife, a rancher in Oregon tried to repeat the soul-weighing experiment with a dozen sheep in early 2000. Most of them gained between 30 and 200 grams after death, although the increase lasted only a few seconds before the sheep returned to their original weight. Yes, skeptics may argue that all this is nonsense. But the existence of this mysterious substance called the soul is claimed by all world religions without exception. This means that it really exists, but since after McDougall no one else in the scientific world dared to repeat his experiment, there is simply no scientific evidence of the existence of the mysterious substance that animates our body and is called the soul.